This isn't a market crash story, and it's not a prediction, it's a recognition. Because every major financial reset in modern history had the same moment, the point where the system crossed a line it couldn't step back over. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Right now, the United States is running trillion-dollar annual deficits while interest costs alone are consuming hundreds of billions per year. That combination has appeared before, and it has never ended gently. Most people never notice the line when it's crossed. They only recognize it later, when prices behave differently, when old rules stop working, and when explanations stop matching what they're experiencing in real life. The United States is at that point now, not because of one crisis, not because of one bad decision, but because a set of limits that once anchored the system have already been breached. Debt relative to output, money creation relative to trust, asset prices relative to real production. This has happened before, in the early 1930s, when debt overwhelmed income and deflation destroyed balance sheets. In 1971, when the dollar broke its final link to gold and the monetary system quietly changed forever. In 2008, when leverage exceeded what the system could absorb and markets froze. Each time, people said the same things. This is temporary. The system will correct. Authorities have it under control. And each time, they were wrong. Not because they were foolish, but because they misunderstood where the line actually was. That line is never crossed with a collapse. It's crossed when stability becomes artificial. When markets rise, not because risk is falling, but because intervention is expanding. When deficits stop being cyclical and become permanent. When prices no longer signal scarcity or abundance, but policy. That's where we are now. You can already feel it. Money doesn't stretch the way it used to. Assets don't behave the way the textbooks say they should. 2026 doesn't represent the beginning of this process. It represents the point where the consequences become impossible to ignore. History shows that once this line is crossed, markets don't revert. They reorganize. Capital moves differently. And the past stops being a reliable guide to what comes next. To understand why precious metals are behaving the way they are, and why this isn't just another rally, you first need to understand where we are in the cycle. Because the most dangerous moments in markets are never the crashes. They're the transitions people only recognize after they're already living inside them. Every time a system crosses that line, the story looks different on the surface. But underneath, the mechanics are always the same. History doesn't repeat headlines, it repeats structures. In the early 1930s, the United States didn't collapse because people stopped working. It collapsed because debt grew faster than income. When cash flows broke, assets had to be repriced, not gradually, violently. In 1971, there was no crash announcement, no panic. The dollar simply lost its anchor. Gold was removed from the system, liquidity expanded, and confidence quietly shifted. The consequences came later: inflation, volatility, and a decade where real returns disappeared. In 2008, markets didn't fail because homes suddenly lost value. They failed because leverage exceeded what the system could absorb. When trust broke, liquidity vanished overnight. Prices didn't adjust. They snapped. Different eras, different triggers, same pattern. Each time, authorities tried to reassure markets. Each time, they promised stability. And each time, the adjustment didn't show up where people expected. It showed up in purchasing power, in asset behavior, in long stretches where traditional portfolios stopped working. That's the key point. The damage isn't immediate, it's structural. When a system crosses the line, markets don't crash and then recover back to normal. They reset the definition of normal. Volatility increases, correlations change. Safe assets stop acting safe. Risk assets stop compensating for risk. And the people who suffer most are the ones waiting for things to go back to the way they were. This is why precious metals always re-enter the story at this stage. Not because of fear, not because of speculation, but because when trust erodes and anchors are removed, markets start searching for something that doesn't depend on policy promises. That search has begun before in every major transition, and it never happens at the bottom. It happens while things still look stable, which is why the next question matters more than prices. What makes this time different, and why the old playbook may no longer apply? What makes this moment dangerous isn't excess, it's convergence. In previous cycles, pressure came from one direction at a time: debt, or inflation, or leverage, or geopolitics. Rarely all at once. Today, they're stacked. Federal debt has moved from cyclical to structural. Annual deficits are no longer tied to recessions. They persist during expansion. That alone changes the math. Interest expense compounds even when growth slows, forcing policy choices into narrower and narrower channels. At the same time, monetary policy has lost flexibility. Rates are high enough to stress the system, but cutting them aggressively risks reigniting inflation. Holding them steady risks slowing growth while deficits expand anyway. This is the trap. Layer on top of that a supply-constrained world. Energy is no longer abundant and frictionless. Critical materials are no longer purely economic. Supply chains are no longer optimized for efficiency, but for security. That matters because the modern financial system was built on assumptions that no longer hold. Cheap energy, stable globalization, predictable capital flows. Those assumptions kept costs low and volatility contained for decades. They are breaking down together. This is why comparisons to past cycles miss the point. The question isn't whether markets have survived high debt before. They have. The question is whether they've done so while simultaneously managing persistent inflation risk, supply constraints, and geopolitical fragmentation. They haven't. And this is why 2025 and 2026 mark a transition phase, not a turning point. The system is adjusting to a new set of constraints, and markets are repricing what stability actually costs. That repricing doesn't show up as a single event. It shows up as changed behavior. Capital becomes more selective. Liquidity becomes more conditional. Assets that relied on permanent expansion start behaving differently. This is the environment where historical anchors regain relevance, not because people are nostalgic, but because uncertainty forces markets to reprice what they trust. Which brings the focus back to precious metals, not as a trade, as a signal. Because when gold and silver start behaving less like commodities and more like insurance, it's usually because the system has already moved into a new phase. And once that shift happens, the old playbook doesn't just underperform, it stops working altogether. At this stage of every cycle, the same beliefs resurface. That policymakers will manage the outcome, that markets will self-correct, that innovation, productivity, or growth will absorb the pressure. Those beliefs feel rational because they've worked before, just not at this point in the cycle. Once a system crosses the line, intervention doesn't restore balance. It redistributes stress. It delays recognition. It shifts the cost from visible collapse to prolonged erosion. This is where many people misread stability. Markets don't look broken. Indices still trade. Credit still flows. Employment remains strong enough to sustain confidence. On the surface, nothing appears urgent. But underneath, prices stop sending clean signals. Asset values rise not because risk is falling, but because liquidity is searching for protection. Volatility is suppressed not by health, but by policy backstops. Losses don't disappear. They're deferred. This has happened before. In the 1970s, inflation didn't explode overnight. It lingered. Real wages eroded. Returns existed on paper but vanished after inflation. Stability became an illusion measured in nominal terms. In the years after 2008, markets recovered, but the cost was dependence. Each shock required larger intervention. Each cycle ended with less resilience than the one before. That pattern is visible again. The belief that central banks can fine-tune outcomes ignores the scale of the constraints they now face. Debt levels limit tightening. Inflation limits easing. Political pressure limits patience. There is no clean exit. And innovation, while real, doesn't fix balance sheets. Technology can improve efficiency, but it can't erase structural deficits or restore trust once anchors are removed. This is the phase where people confuse motion with progress. Markets move, prices change, narratives shift, but the underlying imbalance remains, which is why the next phase rarely announces itself as a crisis. It shows up as frustration, as confusion, as a sense that effort produces less result. That's when portfolios built for the old regime start to disappoint. And that's why the question stops being whether authorities can manage markets. It becomes whether markets are still operating under the same rules at all. The answer to that question determines what breaks first. At this stage, systems don't fail everywhere at once. They fail where pressure concentrates, and pressure always looks for the weakest link. Historically, the first thing to break is not growth. It's confidence in pricing. Markets start moving in ways that no longer match fundamentals, because fundamentals themselves have been distorted for too long. This is where correlations shift. Assets that were supposed to hedge each other begin moving together. Diversification stops working the way it did before. Portfolios built on decades of historical data start producing outcomes no model predicted. That's not randomness. That's regime change. The next fracture usually appears in liquidity, not a total freeze but selective stress. Some markets function normally, others thin out. Bid-ask spreads widen. Depth disappears. Transactions still happen, but at a cost that wasn't there before. This is how stress hides in plain sight. Credit is still available, but only to the strongest balance sheets. Everyone else pays more or is quietly rationed out. This is when refinancing risk replaces default risk as the dominant concern. And then comes the silent break. Real returns turn negative even when nominal numbers look fine. Assets rise, but purchasing power falls. Income grows, but expenses grow faster. People feel like they're moving but not advancing. This is where the transition becomes personal. Savings stop compounding the way they used to. Traditional safe allocations stop preserving value. Long-term planning becomes harder because the future no longer resembles the past. History shows this pattern clearly. In the late 1960s, stocks rose for years, but real wealth eroded. In the early 2000s, housing appeared stable while purchasing power shifted elsewhere. After 2009, markets recovered, but required constant support to stay upright. Each time, the first break wasn't a crash. It was the realization that the old framework no longer worked. That realization forces capital to move, not all at once, but persistently, away from assets dependent on perpetual expansion, toward assets that don't rely on confidence to function. This is why precious metals don't spike first. They grind higher while belief drains out of the system. And once that process starts, it doesn't reverse because of a speech, a rate cut, or a reassuring headline. It only ends when the system finishes repricing itself. Which brings us to the final question. If this process continues, and history suggests it will, how does it resolve, and who pays the cost? When a system reaches this phase, outcomes narrow quickly. There aren't dozens of possible endings. History shows there are only a few. The first path is inflationary resolution. Debt isn't paid down, it's diluted. Currency loses purchasing power slowly enough to avoid panic, but steadily enough to reset real obligations. On paper, everything survives. In reality, savers absorb the loss. This is how Rome managed its debt, how post-war Britain did it, how much of the 1970s quietly played out. Nominal stability, real erosion. The second path is financial repression. Rates are held below inflation. Capital controls appear quietly. Regulations steer money into safe channels that primarily fund government needs. Returns exist, but they're capped. Risk is socialized. Opportunity narrows. Japan followed this path for decades. Southern Europe after 2010 followed a version of it. Stability is maintained, but at the cost of growth and dynamism. The third path is disorder. This is the least common, but the most visible. Confidence breaks faster than policy can respond. Markets gap. Liquidity disappears. Prices overshoot violently before settling into a new equilibrium. This happened in 1931, in parts of Asia in 1997, in emerging markets repeatedly. The United States has historically avoided this path by choosing the first two, and the signs today suggest the same instincts are in place. Inflation tolerated above targets. Debt rolled rather than reduced. Intervention preferred over adjustment. That tells you something important. The system isn't trying to collapse. It's trying to survive. But survival has a cost. It means returns become harder to earn. It means purchasing power becomes harder to protect. It means volatility shifts from markets into daily life. This is why the transition feels frustrating rather than dramatic. People work more, save more, and feel like they're falling behind anyway. And this is where precious metals historically change role again, not as a speculative hedge, but as a reference point. A way markets quietly measure how much value has leaked out of paper systems over time, which sets up the final question. If this doesn't end in a single event, but in a drawn-out adjustment, What should people be paying attention to now, before the shift becomes obvious to everyone else? This is the part most people misunderstand. Systems like this don't end with a warning shot. They end with recognition. By the time the shift feels obvious, it's already been priced in. Not fully, but enough that the easy adjustments are gone. History is clear on this. In the 1930s, people didn't wake up one morning and realize the old world was over. They adjusted year by year as purchasing power eroded and opportunity narrowed. In the 1970s, inflation wasn't a shock. It was a grind, a decade where money worked harder to stand still. After 2008, markets recovered, but the recovery depended on permanent intervention. What looked like stability was actually dependence. Each time, the mistake was the same. People waited for a signal that would never arrive. A headline, a declaration, a clear moment to act. It never came. Instead, the cost showed up quietly, in weaker real returns, in savings that didn't stretch as far, in portfolios that required more risk just to keep up. That's where we are again. This isn't about predicting collapse, it's about understanding transition. Once a system crosses the line, it doesn't snap back. It adapts. And adaptation always has winners and losers. Not based on intelligence, but on positioning. Those who understand the pattern early don't panic. They adjust expectations. They stop relying on assumptions that belong to a different era. Those who don't spend years wondering why the system feels harder, more fragile, and less rewarding than it used to. That's why precious metals matter in this story. Not as a trade, not as a bet, but as a signal that the system itself is being remeasured. When gold and silver stop behaving like commodities and start behaving like anchors, history says the transition is already underway. 2026 isn't the beginning. It's the moment when denial becomes expensive. The line has already been crossed. The only remaining question is whether you recognize the pattern before the cost becomes impossible to ignore.